The damp chill of the Forest of Dean settled into his bones as he tightened the drawstrings of his jacket, the thin material doing little against the creeping cold. He had found a spot just far enough from the trails tucked behind a dense thicket of gnarled hawthorn and bramble, where the world felt still, untouched. The tent, cheap and fraying at the edges, was barely more than a sheet of nylon, but it would do. It had to. He crouched low, sweeping away the damp leaves before rolling out his sleeping bag. He had spent too many nights on hard floors, under the flickering strip lights of shelters that smelled of sweat and stale desperation. A roof, they had called it, a safe space. But he knew better. He had seen the fights break out over a half-eaten sandwich, heard the hacking coughs of men who wouldn't last the winter. He had felt the weight of watching his few possessions disappear whilst he slept. The forest might be cold, but at least it was honest. He sat back, exhaling slow, watching the mist of his breath disappear into the darkness. This wasn't the wild. Not really. He wasn't some survivalist carving out a life against the elements. He was just a man with nowhere else to go. But here, beneath the towering oaks and whispering pines, he could pretend. Pretend that this was his choice. That he had walked into the trees not as a man running from something, but as one searching for something else. He pulled the sleeping bag around him, listening to the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. The loneliness was different here. Not the sharp, gnawing kind he had felt on the city streets, but something quieter. He could live with that, at least for tonight. Lying back, he stared up at the canopy, where the branches tangled together like an old net, the sky beyond barely visible. He could hear the wind shift through the leaves, rustling like whispers between ghosts. His stomach ached, a dull, familiar pain that came and went with the rhythm of his days. He had eaten earlier, a half-stale sandwich and a cereal bar he'd managed to scavenge from the last town, but it hadn't been enough. It never was. He wondered, not for the first time, if he could survive out here like people used to, like the indigenous tribes of other countries, and the ones that used to live here, before the world became what it is now. Could he hunt? Could he set traps, track animals, bring down a deer, or even a boar? The thought of it seemed impossible, yet hunger made a man consider things he never would have before. He had never killed anything before, not really. But he imagined the weight of a knife in his hand, the feeling of striking true, the flash of panic in the animal's eyes before stillness took over. Could he do it? Would he have the nerve? Right now, he thought he'd settle for a frog. He had read somewhere that people used to eat them, frying up the legs like some kind of delicacy. His stomach groaned at the thought. The truth was, he didn't have the skills. He wasn't a hunter, wasn't a woodsman. He was just a man who had run out of places to hide. But still, the idea gnawed at him. If he stayed out here long enough, maybe he'd learn. Maybe he'd have to. The thought was always there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. How long could he really do this before someone found him? Before a hiker stumbled across his little hideaway, took one look at his ragged tent and sunken face, and decided he didn't belong. They'd call the police, and the police would move him on, back to the streets, back to the shelters, back to everything he was trying to escape. But maybe, just maybe, he could last a while. If he kept off of the trails, stayed quiet, moved his camp when he needed to, maybe the forest could be home. He shifted in his sleeping bag, curling into himself for some warmth. His stomach still twisted with hunger, but exhaustion was catching up, pulling him under in slow, heavy waves. He let himself sink into it, let the sounds of the forest wash over him. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of something small moving through the leaves. His mind wandered again, briefly to the wild boar he knew who roamed these woods. He'd seen the signs, roots torn up, hoof prints in the mud. They could be dangerous, but only if provoked. He'd seen more vicious creatures back in the shelters. He closed his eyes, breathing deep, willing himself to sleep. Then, snap! A twig, breaking somewhere close. Too close. His eyes flew open, his body rigid. The cold was forgotten now, replaced by the prickle of adrenaline running up his spine. He strained his ears, holding his breath, listening. Something was out there. His mind raced. Could be some local toff out for a midnight wander, pissed up on expensive whiskey looking for trouble. And worse, some of those knobheads who came out here to hunt with dogs, the kind who thought the countryside was theirs alone. He'd crossed paths with their type before, back when he'd tried kipping under a railway bridge outside of a well-to-do village. They didn't like people like him, and he had no illusions about what might happen if they found him here. He stayed frozen, ears straining. Then he heard it. A low, heavy huff. The kind of breath that only comes from something big. His skin prickled. Not people, then. Something else. A boar? Maybe. He knew they could get massive. Ugly brutes with thick skulls and tusks that could gut a man if they wanted to. But they only attacked when they felt cornered, didn't they? He hadn't seen any signs of one near his camp. No fresh tracks, no churned up earth. Another huff, this time closer. He swallowed hard, slowly, carefully pulling himself upright in his sleeping bag. His fingers found the handle of his knife, the small battered thing that had mostly been used for show until now. It felt pitiful in his grip, useless against something that could weigh as much as he did. The night pressed in around him, thick with silence. Then another sound, low, deep, almost like a growl. His breath caught in his throat. Whatever was out there, it wasn't walking away. The thin fabric of the tent bowed inward, something heavy pressing against it. His breath hitched. His heart pounded so hard he swore whatever was out there could hear it. The huffing grew louder, thick and damp, the sound of something sniffing, searching. Then a deep exhale, right by his ear. His fingers clenched around the knife, but what was he supposed to do? Stab blindly through the tent and risk making whatever this was angry? Stay still and pray it had lost interest? His body screamed at him to move, to run. But where? Into the dark woods with something this big lurking just outside? The pressure in the tent increased, the material stretching, creaking. He could feel the heat of the thing's breath through the fabric, could smell it now. Was it earthy, damp, and wild? His mind raced through every possibility. A boar, maybe? But they usually root around, not press themselves against things like this. A deer? But deer didn't growl, did they? The tent shifted again, the weight rolling slightly to one side. The thing was moving, circling, sniffing. His throat was dry, his whole body locked in place, caught between terror and the desperate need to do something. Then silence. The weight lifted. The sniffing stopped. A small broken whimper escaped his lips before he could stop it. He clenched his jaw, trying to steady his breathing, but his heart was hammering so hard it felt like it might burst through his ribs. The silence stretched thin. Every nerve in his body braced for whatever came next. Then, laughter. Harsh, mocking, human. I think he's gonna piss himself. Another voice, younger, sharper. What's wrong, mate? Thought the big bad wolf was coming for you. His body went from terror to rage in an instant. The fear in his chest curdled, turning into something hot and bitter. He let out a furious shout, his voice raw in the cold night air. Bugger off and leave me alone! More laughter. He heard the crunch of boots on leaves circling his tent, low voices muttering just out of earshot. A flicker of torchlight cut through the thin fabric, throwing warped shadows across his little shelter. Bastards. He should have known. Some posh country pricks, probably drunk, having a laugh at his expense. He dealt with their kind before, the ones who saw people like him as a joke, as entertainment. He tightened his grip on his knife, his knuckles white. He didn't want trouble, but if they came any closer, if they thought he was some easy target, some scared little stray they could push around. His breathing slowed, his body tensed. If they wanted a game, they were about to find out he wasn't playing. Get a job, you mooching git, one voice shouted. Stop taking up space, you doe-like scum, another mocked, voice thick with booze and cruelty. Rage fled in him, hot and wild, his fists clenching so tight his nails bit into his palms. He wanted to charge out of the tent, to do something, to make them feel even a fraction of the humiliation and fury twisting inside him. But he forced himself to stay still, breathing hard through his nose, knowing that if he acted now, he'd only make things worse. Then something changed. A sound, distant but unmistakable, like a buzzing, crackling static. It rose through the trees, warbling and uneven, like a radio struggling to find a station. The fuck? One of the voices asked, uncertain now. Another chuckled, trying to keep the bravado going. Someone else out here probably having a shindig setting up a speaker. We should crash it, another said. See if they're more fun than this twat. Muttered agreement. Boots shuffled against leaves as they turned their attention elsewhere. Then, just as relief started to settle in, one of them spoke again. One sec, lads. Gotta make sure our mate stays warm. A heartbeat later, he heard the whoosh of fire catching, and his stomach dropped. He twisted around just in time to see the flames start licking up the side of his tent, turning the cheap fabric into curling black strips. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. Then the heat hit him. The heat surged, curling through the tent like a living thing, and panic wrapped its claws around him. His fingers scrambled for the zip, but in his desperation it refused to budge. It was stuck, jammed at an awkward angle, refusing to move no matter how hard he yanked. Outside, the laughter grew, their jeering voices almost drowned out by the crackle of the flames. And then, that sound again. The buzzing, the static, rising with the fire like the two were somehow feeding off of each other. It clawed into his ears, an unbearable whine as if the air itself was fraying apart. His breaths became fast and ragged. His fingers were numb, shaking, still fighting with the goddamn zip. Move, move, move! Then, the laughter stopped. For the briefest moment, all he could hear was the fire and his own frantic breathing. But then screaming. Horrible, raw, real screaming. Not drunken hollers, not taunting. Terror. Agony. The zip finally gave way, but he hesitated, frozen in place as something wet, something heavy hit the ground just beyond his burning tent. One of them let out a gurgling choke. Another wailed, a sound so primal it sent ice flooding through his veins. The buzzing static roared now, so loud it rattled in his skull. Something was out there. The fire roared behind him, its heat searing the air as the tent buckled under the flames. He had no time to think about what was out there, no time to process the static that was still buzzing in his ears like a warning. His clothes were already starting to feel hot against his skin. He had to move. With a wild, panicked leap, he threw himself out of the burning tent, his limbs tangled in the fabric. He crashed to the ground, tumbling awkwardly onto his back, the world spinning around him. His chest heaved as he scrambled to his feet, blinking against the blinding light of the fire. But some movement other than the flames dancing caught his eye. A figure too quick to fully see shot through the flickering shadows. He barely had time to process the image before he realized what it was. A man, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, desperately flailing as he was yanked upward out of the light. His primal scream ripped from his throat, loud, raw, and then cut off almost instantly. The buzzing in his ears died with a sickening crunch, as if something had snapped its spine with a single brutal motion. His heart skipped. He sat there, frozen, the panic rising in his chest. The man's scream, his death, echoing in his mind. Before he could move, before he could run, it happened. A torrent of blood poured down upon him, splattering across his face, soaking his clothes. It rained from the trees above, a horrific, slick shower of crimson that seemed endless. He could hear the wet thud of it landing, the sickening drip of it hitting the ground around him. He was covered, drowning in it, his chest tight with the sickening scent of iron. Get up, get up. But his body didn't move. He just stared at the dark, wet sky, his pulse thundering in his ears, unable to tear his eyes away from the crimson deluge, until his willpower broke him through that unexplainable paralysis. And he ran. He didn't stop. Not for a second. The adrenaline flooded his veins, making his legs move faster, his breathing coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The forest, once so vast and imposing, now felt like a suffocating prison, each tree a reminder of the nightmare still lurking in the dark. His chest burned with effort, but he ignored it. Every snap of a branch, every crackle of leaves underfoot only pushed him forward. The blood still clung to him, his clothes soaked in it, his skin sticky and slick. It weighed him down, but he kept running. The sound of his footsteps was deafening in his ears, as was the relentless buzzing static that screeched. It refused to leave. Was it following him? He couldn't tell. All he knew was that every second spent running felt like an eternity. It was impossible to say how much time had passed. He didn't stop to check. The world blurred around him, trees, brush, and undergrowth flicking by as he darted through it, his breath coming in painful bursts. The only thing he could focus on now was the need to escape. Finally, after what felt like hours, the forest started to thin. The trees grew more scattered, and the ground softened, signaling the edge of the woods. He saw it then, a strip of tarmac cutting through the dark, faint headlights in the distance. He stumbled forward, faster now, a frantic desperation propelling him as he broke through the last of the trees. His foot hit the road with a jolt, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his limbs trembling. But he wasn't safe yet. He forced himself to stand, his hands trembling as he raised them, waving wildly in front of the headlights. A car. Please. He had to make it stop. He couldn't let himself fall apart here, not now. The car slowed, pulling to the side of the road with a squeal of tires. A woman's face appeared at the window, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. She took in his appearance. Wild eyes, disheveled hair, clothes soaked in blood, and the words caught in his throat. "Please," he rasped, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper above the sound of his labored breathing. "Please, take me somewhere, anywhere, just don't leave me here." Her face shifted from shock to hesitation. But she opened the door, and he all but fell into the seat, the door slamming shut behind him. The car pulled away from the side of the road, the lights cutting through the dark. For a moment there was only the sound of the engine and the steady hum of the tires on the asphalt. He sank back into the seat, trying to steady his breathing, his mind still caught up in the chaos of the forest. His thoughts were a blur, fragments of horror flashing through him like a movie on fast forward. But as the car sped away from the woods, the images became clear. The bodies, the mangled, bloody remains. One body in particular haunted him. The man, his head split open. The bottom half of his face was entirely gone, his jaws, nose, his mouth, nothing but a gruesome hollowed-out cavity. His eyes, wide in shock, froze in a state of pure terror. They stared at him as he ran past, unblinking, the vacant shock still lingering in them even in death. The memory churned his gut, twisting, threatening to pull him back into that nightmare. The buzzing, the static, the screams. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms to his face. But the images wouldn't fade. They stayed with him, burned into the back of his eyelids. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, a deafening rhythm, fear that wouldn't let him forget what he had seen, what he had narrowly escaped. And even as the car's headlights lit the road ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was still out there, waiting and watching.